you need to understand how the client and server architecture actually works. Now, let's take for instance that we have a client that wants to make a request to a server. The client is going to make this request to the server. The server is going to check if this request involves saving that request to the database. And then if that request involves saving the database, it's going to save that request to the database, and the database is going to respond back to the server, and then the server is going to respond back to the client. But if the server actually checks and there is no request that actually needs to be saved to the database, the server is going to send back that request, the response back to the client. Now let's take for this other diagram now. If the client actually sends that request, because in this instance there is going to be a problem. What is going to be the problem? There are certain things that the client does not need to wait for, particularly if you're talking about when a client actually clicks the button. The client does not need to wait for the server to respond. For instance, if the client is actually filling out a form, the client does not need to wait for the server to know what exactly information that the client needs to input into that server. That's exactly what JavaScript actually does, which is client-side validation, animations, and most of other stuff that JavaScript actually does, which is what the client side actually is. So let's take, for instance, on the second diagram, the client actually sends this request. The client side actually intercepts that request, checks if it is a request that this client side needs to respond to. If it is a request that this client side can actually handle, the client side is going to respond back to that request. So if it is a request that needs to be sent to the server, this client side is going to send that request to the server. The server is going to check if it is a request that needs to be saved. The server is going to save it to the database, and then the database will respond back to the server, and then the server is going to send that request to the client, and then the client will now the client side will now respond back to the client. So there are certain things, for instance, animations, buttons, and most of that stuff, client-side validation, and a lot of things that JavaScript actually does that do not need to be sent to the server. Most of those information are actually handled on the client side. And that is exactly where the concept of the JavaScript event loop comes in. Because how does the client side know which of those requests that needs to be sent to the server, or which of those requests that needs to be responded to? That's exactly where the JavaScript event loop actually comes in. Now let's take a look at how the JavaScript event loop actually works right now. Now, in this instance, the client is going to send a request to the client side, which is the JavaScript event loop is going to intercept that request and place most of those requests in a thread. And then this is actually the event loop. Most of those requests are actually, well, you can see we have process 1, process 2, process 3, depending on how many processes are actually being running. Now, these responses are actually being queued and responded to. Like you already know that JavaScript is actually top to bottom. When you write your code in JavaScript, the JavaScript engine actually reads your code from the top down to the bottom. So the JavaScript is going to check this process 1. Does this process needs a database? Does it need a server to respond to that request to the client? If it does not, JavaScript is going to respond to it. If it does need any of those processes, the JavaScript is going to place it into the server, and then the server is going to check again, does this information needs to be saved in the database? If it does, it's going to send back that request to the database, and then the database is going to respond. Now, this is exactly the concept that the JavaScript event loop is involved. Now, for instance, let's take for instance that you write your JavaScript, and then this request that actually needs to be sent to the server and equally needs to be sent to the database. If this request does not have any information that JavaScript needs to send back to the client. This request actually will now stop the other processes from working because JavaScript is going to wait for responses for this request, going to handle this request completely before JavaScript will handle process 2. This is exactly where the concept of blocking and non-blocking actually comes in. Because if, for instance, that this request does not give JavaScript an explicit instruction on what to do, JavaScript is going to wait until there's an instruction on what to do to complete these responses, this request, before JavaScript will go to the next request. So what do we need to do at this instance? That's exactly where the concept of callback function actually is. So if, for instance, the client actually sends a request, if this request actually involves sending a response, sending information to the server, and also from the server to the database, this request needs to have what they call a callback function or promises or any other stuff. I'm going to make a video on callback functions and then promises and other stuff as well. But for now, you just need to know that when this request is actually sent by the client, JavaScript actually intercepts those requests and checks through the event loop and then see which of those responses which of these needs to be responded to. JavaScript is going to read through from top to bottom. If any of these processes involve sending a request down to the server and also database, JavaScript is going to continue, and there is a callback function. JavaScript is going to continue these other processes, and then this callback function is going to return back when these processes has been completed. That's exactly how the JavaScript event loop actually works. If you have any question, please ask me on the comments view. Thank you.